Yeah, so hey, good afternoon. First, before I start, I want you to help me congratulate Al, who was just indoctrinated into the Brentwood High School Hall of Fame. The ceremony will be in October, so I know all of you are taking a note right now. Make sure that you all come and support him in that, quite an honor, actually. So again, congratulations.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I want to thank each and every one of you for the opportunity to be here. So here it is, it's Thursday afternoon, this is the end of your semester, and you have to put up with me for about an hour or so, right? So I know what's going through your minds. Let me ask a question first off. How many of you have been to the borders of the United States? Any border of the United States? Oh, whereabouts? Excuse me?
Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls, okay.
Same.
Same? You guys take a field trip there? Anybody else? Same thing, Niagara Falls.
Cuba.
Cuba, interesting. Tijuana. You actually went into Tijuana? Wow. Congratulations. What did you think about the San Ysidro Port of Entry when you were coming back?
I was like 6, so I don't know.
Oh, okay. All right. So, what I'd hope to do is, I would suspect that throughout the course and your studies, that you kind of had to follow a certain syllabus, how to read and write some certain things. And I really wanted to take this opportunity, now that you have a lot of information within the criminal justice arena, is to really turn this discussion, it is a discussion, this is not a lecture, right? What I'm going to be showing you is hopefully to bring a little bit of the border to you this afternoon. Or for some of you that may be thinking about future opportunities in careers within the broad criminal justice perspective, whether it's national security, whether it's within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice. I have had the opportunity in almost 30 years in working with the federal government to work with a host of those agencies that do law enforcement and public safety work. And so to the extent that I can answer any of the questions for you today, I would want to make sure that I do that so that it is, again, of value to you. All right? And a couple of other things too. So you have the professor here, you have the professor's boss. When it comes to the questions, you have earned the right to ask me anything. So what that means is if you're thinking about a question, and you're thinking, but geez, what's my teacher going to say? They cannot, after I leave, say, hey, how come you asked the chief that question? You weren't supposed to. You have earned the right. I still consider myself a public servant. And most of you are or will be soon taxpayers. So I actually work for you. And because of that, and because of my passion for national security, since I was probably your age, sitting in a class very similar to this, I have always wanted to give back to this country. And in doing so, I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask me questions. The beauty now that I'm retired, is I don't have to watch what I say as much, right? And so we can have a really interesting discussion. And it doesn't have to be necessarily on this. Fair enough? So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start very basic on a background just about the organization. I'm not going to run you through organizational charts. I'm not going to go through the history from May 28, 1924 and progress every week since then. All right, we have in the Border Patrol, which was one of the 3 operational components within U.S. Customs and Border Protection in the larger department, which is the Department of Homeland Security. We are coming up on 92 years in existence. First in the Department of Labor, then under the Department of Justice, and now under the Department of Homeland Security. 92 years. We like to say within the Border Patrol, that's 92 years of tradition, unhampered by progress. We will see over the course of some of this history on what has happened along our borders and how has that threat changed a little bit. The next thing I want to talk about is the environment. Now, for the purpose of this and for time, I'm really just going to focus on a really short period of time on the physical environment of the border. And for the purpose of the discussion, I'm really going to focus on the southern border with Mexico. All right? We can also talk, if you're interested, about the operational environment, the political environment. And there's a lot of things that happen where government agencies and leaders within those agencies have to take into consideration when you're trying to protect this country. Next on the list, I'll talk very briefly about some threats and how the adversaries, how did smuggling organizations grow, and I'll try to give you tell you some stories through some of the pictures that I brought to kind of give you a sense on how some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures have changed over time as we became a lot more proficient in terms of our own capabilities, which takes us to the capabilities piece. Right? So how do we defend this country against those that would do us harm? Now, I'm not going to go through a laundry list of technology, unattended ground sensors, and ground-based radar. If you're interested, great. Ask those questions, and we can talk a little bit about that. I'm going to focus on one in particular because I believe, and I could be wrong on this, by the way, I believe it's going to fundamentally change the way that we as a country approach border security. And it was an initiative that my team started back in March of 2013. It is unclassified. All this information is unclassified. Interestingly enough, that last portion, when I get to it, on the capabilities, the most briefings that I have done have been with Judge Carter. He's the chairman of the Appropriations Committee on Homeland, on the House side. And I would do, when I was the chief, for 3 years, a quarterly briefing for him and his staff, and a lot of it was contained here. A lot of this was not made public. I've done it in other public settings. Again, it's unclassified, but it's a new approach to border security. I'd like to get your insights into that as well. Then if 80% haven't fallen asleep at that point, for the 20% that have, I have a video that will show a little bit about the border. Again, my ability to perhaps bring a little bit of the border to you, and it really focuses on an area in 2004, 2005, in a place called Yuma, Arizona. Now, Yuma, if you're familiar with Arizona, is just east of the California state line. It's predominantly desert, and there in 2005, we had a big challenge because most of the entries along the southern border were focused in there. We were being inundated, we were being crushed every day and every night with drug smugglers and human smugglers, and we had to figure out what we were going to do. And this kind of takes you through a little bit of that chronology to finish up the presentation, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to start with the mission statement, because we are nothing unless we have a mission statement. It's very basic, it's very brief, I'll just let you read it. The question that I get is, hey, how many female Border Patrol agents do you have? And this is always an opportunity for me to recruit. So I'm going to shamelessly plug the organization that I'm still very fond of. And if you are interested, or you have family members or friends that may be interested in federal law enforcement or law enforcement in general, just let me know. Right now, 5% of our workforce is female. And you'll see here about 30% of that's former military. And what we're trying to do is grow the ranks specifically in a lot of demographic areas. And if you're interested in that, we can talk about that a little bit later. Again, the history. Now, if you ask a Border Patrol agent generally will know two things. First and foremost is going to be our birth date, which I've stated earlier. And the second thing is going to be their class number. And for those keeping score at home, I graduated in the 208th session of the United States Border Patrol. That was on 7 June of 1987 is when I entered on duty. And I graduated out of the academy, which was then in Glencoe, Georgia, on 15 October. One of the best opportunities that I had to really get indoctrinated into an organization and an institution that had, even back then, its fundamental mission is to protect this country. And then something really interesting happened post 9/11. And you see in March of 2003, you had 22 federal agencies, over 188,000 employees came together. We call it was the clash, the Big Bang in the National Capital Region, and the Department of Homeland Security stood up. That in and of itself, when you think about it, was the largest transformation in our federal government since the Department of Defense in the late 40s. And it's second only in terms of its size to the Department of Defense. So I don't want to make this an organization briefing or talk about the department as the department, but I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of background about the enormity in terms of the mission space and what role specifically the Border Patrol plays in that space. And again, to kind of round off, who we are and where we are. So the Border Patrol, generally when I talk to audiences and I talk about the border, except for perhaps this group, because a lot of you are very familiar with the northern border, most people just think about the border with the contiguous country of Mexico. One is because it's probably gained the most attention over the past couple of decades. The vast majority of activity and threats are located on the southern border, and so a lot of times people just think that we just do missions and have personnel and technology in those locations. If you look at the geography, there's approximately 4,000 miles of border with Canada. And we do a lot of work, by the way, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. Any Dudley Do-Right fans in the audience? No, I'm dating myself, right? Okay. So RCMP, very professional. It's very similar to the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in our country. They have patrol capabilities, but they also do a lot of federal investigative work in the country of Canada. Canada is interesting when you look at it from in terms of a threat standpoint, because you have 90% of the population in Canada lives within 100 air miles of the border with the United States. A lot of population, a lot of potential threats, a lot of criminal activity that hides within that legitimate infrastructure to support the two countries, both in terms of flow of people and the flow of goods for economic prosperity for both. Transitioning down to the southern border is about 2,000 miles of the border with Mexico. And then we have coastal responsibility in and along with the United States Coast Guard, which is the lead in what they call the blue water, which is the deep water outside of the 12-mile international limits of the border. And so we have capabilities and we have agents assigned in New Orleans, Miami, and in Puerto Rico. Any questions in terms of how we're laid out? And don't worry about the organizational structure. For those, we've got 4 corridors to the north and to the south. There's 9 Border Patrol, what we call sectors. Think of these as command and control centers in Mexico, and then there's across the top 8 along the northern border with Canada. When I came to the United States Border Patrol, there was less than 3,000 Border Patrol agents. I went to a station called Douglas, Arizona. Now, if you were with me in my house when I got my letter to report for duty in Douglas, Arizona, remember this is before computers. Just humor me, right? Before computers. I got a letter and it said Douglas, Arizona. And I had no idea where Douglas, Arizona was. So I went to our library in the house and we had an atlas. And I opened up the atlas. My mom was looking over my shoulder. I'm looking Douglas, Arizona. I'm looking at the reference point. I go all the way down. And my mom starts crying because she thinks I'm being stationed in Mexico. And I convinced her. And I was good at doing that, by the way. I convinced her, no, Mom, it wasn't in Mexico. And I couldn't convince myself because it looked like it was in Mexico. It was right on the border. The town right across was a town called Agua Prieta in Mexico, in Sonora, Mexico. And it was the first time that I had gone to probably west of Cleveland, Ohio, as a Border Patrol agent. And from that point, there was about 26 agents assigned to Douglas, Arizona. By contrast, right now, there's over 500 Border Patrol agents assigned. It's not the same station, by the way, because it grew. But we grew, and at some point in time, Congress said the Border Patrol will always maintain 21,370 Border Patrol agents. And if you think of where those are assigned, there's about 18,500 along the southern border with Mexico. There's about 2,212 that are assigned to the northern border across that 4,000 miles of expanse. And there's about 220 or so in those coastal areas that I talked about, which leaves about 200 or so in the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and that was part of my command staff when I was the chief. I'll just let you, this kind of like an eye chart. This is a typical day, one day on average, of what the Border Patrol deals with. And you can imagine there are days when some of this is lower, some of it is higher, but this is on average. There's a lot of activity that happens in and around our border areas that, quite frankly, a lot of people don't know. They have never experienced before. And it's more than just the argument on whether our border is secure or not. And if you're interested in having that discussion and why I don't think it's that simplistic, we'll certainly bring that up during the discussion. So now I want to talk a little bit about the physical environment. As I mentioned before, when I got to the Border Patrol, the only line of demarcation in our country from the international border as it related to any fence was about 3 or 4 strands of barbed wire. Right? So if any of you know, have been around barbed wire fences, they're not very strong. And certainly not going to keep back people. And so what had happened is over the years in the early 80s into the 90s, this country was inundated with hundreds of thousands of people every year, millions, as we were peaking into 2000, when there was 1.6 million people arrested coming into this country illegally. Well, that number does include recidivism. What it doesn't include, by the way, is how many people we didn't catch. And I will tell you, there's no reports on this. It's not in some classified vault in a SCIF in headquarters. We just didn't have the capacity to really understand. We would go through, and you'll see some of that when I show the video, in places like San Diego, California, where you would have what we call the bonsai runs. And you would have thousands of people in Mexico and Tijuana, right as the sun was going down. And you can picture this. There'd be myself and 2 other agents, and our intervals would be maybe 50 meters apart. And we're standing there and we're waiting, and we're looking south into Mexico, and there's a hill. And all of a sudden, the sun's going down, and you can hear the ground rumble. And you see people starting to come up, and they're backlit by the sun going down in the Pacific. And then all of a sudden, there's a signal, and you have thousands of people just start rushing into the United States. And your job is to stop them. So a lot of that has changed, but a lot of people still remember. As a matter of fact, if you look on some of the news outlets, they're still showing some of that old B-roll, and to let people think that that is how the border is, but it isn't. So here's a couple of photos to kind of a before and after, and to show you how we overcame some of the physical environments, the impediments. Now to the left, this is a place in Laredo, Texas. To the right of these bushes right here is the Rio Grande Valley. It's not like a river here. Matter of fact, I remember when, growing up in the greater Pittsburgh area, and the first time I heard about the Rio Grande, right, the Grand River, and I went down and I saw it, I was just totally disappointed, right? In most places, as you can go further west, into places like El Paso, there isn't even water running through them. But even in some of the deepest areas, it's not very wide, which means people bringing in narcotics into this country illegally, all they have to do is get on rafts, which they do, and go right across maybe 25, 30 meters across the river into the United States, and then pop up in areas like this. Now, if you were trying to stop somebody from coming across at night in an area like this, it would be very difficult. Right? We didn't have the camera systems that we do now. We didn't have the lighting systems. So one of the changes and the transformations happens in the physical environment, where we start moving and making the environment a lot more easier for Border Patrol agents to effect the arrest subsequent to the entry. This was a project called Smuggler's Gulch in San Diego, and this actually happened while I was the chief there. It was the largest, both in terms of dollars and the amount of earth that was moved. And if you notice, this is the international boundary fence with Mexico, and this is the same fence here. But you can see what happened to the north of that fence. One is this area. We had agents that were killed in this area trying to drive down a lot of these switchbacks. The primary fence along the border, which started in the late 1990s, came from the military. It was old landing mat fence, right? So it was just steel corrugated steel, where Border Patrol agents in a previous life knew how to weld. And so we had agents out there just starting to weld fence to stop the people and the drugs from coming across the country. But by the way, this only goes maybe about 8 feet or so. And fence, regardless of what you hear, right, was never put up to stop people entirely. What it does do, and it is true, there's a certain segment of the population who cannot physically climb an 8 or 12 or an 18-foot fence, right? But the vast majority of people can. It's not necessarily to stop them. You put up a fence and they're not going to cross there. No, because you actually have to have access, because they're always going to attempt it. They're going to go over it, they're going to go through it, and they're going to go under it. They continue to do that from when I came in the Border Patrol until I left. And they will continue to try. What it does do is it buys us back the tactical advantage of time. That's it. And you start layering that, as we did in San Diego, and this is a secondary fence. This is an all-weather road, and that secondary fence, by the way, is about 18 feet high, it cants to the south, and on top of that you have 3-strand razor wire. So somebody thinking about coming across that area is going to take them a lot longer to do that, which is going to buy us, again, the tactical advantage of time to be able to effect the arrest. But again, this is a place in Deming, New Mexico. This is a place what they call the Boot Hill on the southwest border, where you see there's hardly any infrastructure. There's a chain link fence there. But threats and vulnerabilities to this country as it related to security were overwhelming the organization. And up to and including pre and post 9/11, the country made a radical change in terms of how it viewed border security. And by the way, when I talk about border security, and most of this under a national security context, which was our mission and continues today, do not confuse this with immigration as a policy. That is a huge, and the problem this country, the challenge this country has had over the past decade or two, in my opinion, has been anytime you talk about border security, people automatically think about a policy decision on what you're going to do with the 11 million people that are already here in this country. I used to get the question all the time, either on committee or with the press. Chief, what are you going to do with the 11 million people that are here? That's a policy consideration. I was a federal employee. I was what they considered career. Right? I wasn't appointed by the president. I wasn't confirmed by the Senate. I was a Border Patrol agent. And what I used to tell them is my responsibility, as most law enforcement, If you don't like the law, change the law. We're going to enforce the law as it's written. The other thing is my responsibility is to 350 million people that are living in this country and their safety. I'm not going to refocus my attention on 11 million people, which, by the way, that's not an enforcement action. They're already here. That is a policy consideration. And regardless of where you sit on what we should do with those people, it is an important issue. Don't get me wrong. But don't automatically think that border and national security is in the same realm as a political discussion in policy consideration for people that are here. If you want to talk a little bit more about that, we can. Okay, so I'm going to throw up a couple of pictures here. I'm going to go through these really quick. If you have any questions, please let me know. Upper left-hand column. So one of the things when we talk about threats generally, just keep this in mind. These criminal organizations, transnational criminal organizations, networks, you'll hear some of the phrases, all right? But you're dealing with people. People are smart. And most of these criminal organizations they have one thing in common. What do you think that is? Criminals in general have what in common? They want to do what?
Make money.
Make money, absolutely. So, and it took our organization a while to think about this. This was a radical departure in our thinking and the way and why we changed our strategy in 2012. We started looking at them not as drug smugglers or alien smugglers or human traffickers. We thought of them as a corporation and a business. But we had to understand their center of gravity. We needed to understand their business models. And once we did that, it changed the way that we approach border security. It's really interesting too when you're dealing with a thinking enemy, right? It makes it fun. It makes it challenging. There's never going to be a dull day. Just when you think you've figured them out and you've beat them, you better figure out how they're beating you, and you have to figure it out again. If we win, it's very short-lived because they're going to adjust. The upper left-hand corner is how they adjusted in a place in Naco, Arizona. We start building infrastructure in Naco, Arizona. They were moving narcotics there. We built fence. We added more border patrol agents. We had remote video surveillance systems, daytime, nighttime cameras. We made it more difficult for them to make money. So there's a couple of options that they had. What could they have done? Yes?
Move their crossing.
Absolutely, move somewhere else. They're going to adapt, right? Remember, the thing is border security and dealing with criminals it's not that difficult at times when you think about it. Their basic needs and their basic thought process is basically going to be the same as yours. In this particular case, they chose to try to defeat that, and so they built a catapult. Very ingenious, right? And so you can see the brick of marijuana here. It's in green. And they were launching these bricks of marijuana over to their partners on the north side in the United States. Now you will notice, these are the Mexican military. They're called Sedena. In Mexico, back and forth over the course of the different administrations in Mexico, predominantly the enforcement and border security for them falls on the jurisdictional authority of their military. And so you have Sedena and you have Samara on the Marine side that does. So we'd work a lot with the Mexican military. And when this photo was actually taken, they were just playing with the catapult to see if they could get it to work. So that's why they're in. Because the reason why I qualify that is because I don't want people to take away that the Mexican government is corrupt and they're catapulting narcotics, and we have a video to show it, right? Not suggesting that doesn't happen. That is not the case in this particular picture. This picture, upper right-hand corner, was just, so think in terms of tons and tons, hundreds of tons of narcotics coming across all the time. And one of the challenges is not just getting it across the border, is you got to get it away from the border. And these organizations, these businesses have to do that. And so they bring up elaborate transportation schemes to be able to defeat our checkpoints, and this just happens to be a Border Patrol checkpoint and one of the roads of egress away from the border area. And no, the marijuana wasn't stacked like that when they pulled up to the checkpoint to think that they could fool the Border Patrol agents. That was all deep concealment in a car carrier truck. Probably took them weeks and weeks to put that narcotics, and this just happens to be marijuana, by the way, seal it back up and to try to defeat the canines and the Border Patrol agents going through primary. Here lower left, you'll notice this is not a fence. This is what we call a vehicle barricade. Now you may have seen on some of the news, they always take exception to the fact that, when people say, hey, we have to build a wall, and they go to a place like this, in Yuma, Arizona, and other places in Tucson, where the threat is really vehicles driving across. And because there's so much open desert, that these businesses are not going to then, if we stop them from driving, go on the ground and start walking. There's too many mountains, there's too much desert. The time from entry to assimilation into a house or into a business or a car is in some cases, many days or weeks. And so to defeat them, all you need to do is you don't need an 18 foot fence. You put what's called a vehicle barrier so they can't drive across. So obviously they start trying to figure out ways to get up and over the vehicle barriers. And then we say, okay, well now we're going to increase the size, and then so we build a little bit higher, and they then adapt, and very ingenious, by the way, on how they come up with ways, to defeat an infrastructure like this. And this is just a pickup truck doing what's called an up and over. I had other pictures too where, true story, one of the vehicles actually got stuck on the top of it. Couldn't go up, couldn't go down. The driver just bails off the top of the fence. Our guys rush in from the north side, the Mexicans rush in from the south side, and we're trying to figure out who's going to get the dope. And it was an interesting story. The DPS officer turns on the lights, bus driver pulls over to the side. DPS driver starts approaching the bus driver so he can tell the bus driver that, hey, you got a light out, you need to get that fixed. At that point, the bus door opens and the driver just runs out into the brush. So the DPS trooper, and I've worked with them, right? A trained observer says, hey, there's something suspicious here. We'll come to find out the cartels, and what they did is they retrofitted a bus to make it look like a school bus in the Laredo School District. You can see here the false floor, which was covered with over a ton of marijuana, and they had heads to look like students, so if anybody was driving by. Now we have seen this before, not necessarily in this elaborate scheme, but these organizations are trying to always defeat law enforcement. The upper right-hand corner is narcotics, and this is actually in what's called a bunker. Well, this started back in the late 1990s, or actually about 2004, 2009 time period. So what was happening in South Texas at the time is we were getting better at defeating these businesses. As they were coming across the river, one is we were spotting them a lot sooner. We were setting up, and as soon as they would come over with their rafts at night, we would set up ambushes and we'd make and effect the arrest. We would arrest the people, we would seize the narcotics. We were getting really good at it. So what they decided, because they didn't decide to move, right? Because remember, as these, what they call plazas, right? These are plazas. These are areas along the border where these cartels and these networks own. And they just can't move laterally like they used to 25 years ago. So a lot of times they've been given a spot of ground to work with. And so they have to make do. So what this particular network did is they built these bunkers in Mexico and in the United States, right across the river. And so basically, instead of taking it all the way across the river and then trying to move it up to a vehicle and drive it out, all they had to do was cross, go into an underground bunker in the United States and bury it, and then go right back across the river. So even if we detected it, it took us a while to get there. These were hard to find when we first tried to figure out where the narcotics went. Because generally we would get the bodies, but they would either drop the narcotics in the river that would float, we'd catch it. It took us a while to figure out they were actually building bunkers in the United States and in Mexico to shorten up the trip. Then, about the mid-2000s, came a thing called ultralights. Now this was something I never even heard of until our intel folks, and we had started getting some ground reports from agents that they were hearing what sounded like a lawnmower in the middle of the night going through a canyon in the desert. I think, well, there's no air traffic here, right? We have the AMOC, which is the Air Marine Operations Center in Riverside, California, which has all the feeds from the FAA from this country, it gets all the feeds from NORAD, gets all the feeds from Canada. So we have, if you go into the Riverside at some point, and you go into their operations center, you will see every domestic flight in the air. There will be squawkers, you will be able to identify the tail numbers, what's the flight plan, all that traffic. But nothing was coming across the AMOC center when these ultralights were coming in. The problem was they don't fly at very high altitudes. And generally what was happening is they would fly across the border. You can see generally they can carry approximately 270 pounds with the pilot of cargo. And all they would do is they would drive across, they would land in the United States, the vehicles would be darked out, they would take the narcotics and they'd drive away. We started getting better at detecting them and identifying the ground crews. So now what they've done over the last few years is they don't land anymore. All they do is they have these quick ties, is they get over the drop zone and they pull that and they turn around and go right back to Mexico. So a lot of people, the reason why this is not just a narcotics problem, this is a potential vulnerability problem. Because if they can defeat our air space, and really it's a policy consideration too at this point, is because even though that we're getting better at detecting them, our government does not have a policy of what to do once you've detected them. And what we have been doing is taking a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter and giving them an armed escort back into Mexico. But a lot of times you don't know what is on that cargo. It could be components for or a weapon of mass destruction. At what point do we as a country realize that this is a vulnerability and a threat? This is not just a nuisance in the drug trade. And then finally in the lower right-hand corner is a set of antennas. And this was taken, and it still exists out in the Arizona desert. There are mountains in Arizona and in Mexico across the border. And what the organizations have done is really increase their capability for communication. And as we got better at defeating the guides and the smugglers on the ground, they decided with the advent of technology is they'll do a couple of things. One is this is what's basically called a hide site. You have solar panels here and an antenna array. And you have 2 or 3 individuals that are part of the smuggling network that live in the caves during the day, and at night they come out and they start putting up communications. And they will start having communications with their partners in Mexico. In the United States, what they're doing is they're looking for Border Patrol agents in the area. They're looking for law enforcement. They are the eyes and ears of the cartels as they're going to start moving people and narcotics through the deserts in Arizona. Very difficult to find, very difficult to defeat once we do find them. But we've got some capability in that regard, and if you want me to go into more detail there, I can.
Chief,
Yes?
is with the communication, that's a paramilitary situation. Does that have anything to do with Zetas? Is that their form of operation due to their former military, special military?
It is. A lot of the Zetas, which you will find, and those very closely aligned with prior military experience, are what they call the RIP crews. We were talking about, Agent Brian Terry, who died, in 2015 December, was actually part of a special operations team. You'll see it in my bio. It's called BORTAC, Border Patrol Tactical Unit. And they were actually working the RIP crews. So what happens a lot of times is these cartels will try to rip each other off. And so you have these paramilitary organizations that are in the United States, armed, heavily armed, and they're hunting other people, smuggling people and narcotics to rip them off. It's a very dangerous environment, if you can imagine. They're not necessarily out for law enforcement. They're just trying to reduce the risk of moving narcotics into the United States. They'll let some other organization take the risk, and these RIP crews will try to intercept them. But in order to do that type of operation, though, you have to have communications in these areas, and that's where these 2 or 3 man teams will be up in the mountains. They are resupplied from the ground, so they'll stay up there for weeks at a time, and they'll have resupply both in terms of food and water, or extra batteries for their communications. And when they get up on comms, now they're like air traffic controllers for all the smugglers on the ground. Because when you look at the amount of people that are apprehended by the Border Patrol, for instance, our peak, what we call the high water mark, was in 2000. I mentioned it. We made 1.6 million arrests, and it was true back then. The vast majority of people that we would encounter along the border were foreign nationals from the country of Mexico. That is no longer the case. It's about a 50-50 split. The other 50% really going to Central America, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But what this represents is, on average, for the last 4 years, Border Patrol agents have apprehended. Now, when I say Border Patrol, and I make that distinction, because these are not people coming through legitimate ports of entry, as B1, B2 visitors or F1 students. Right? These are people that are sneaking into the United States because they cannot otherwise do so legally. And that represents over 140 countries. And so when you start looking, and this just shows you areas of where we have made apprehensions on average for the past 4 years, it puts, at least in my mind, a different threat stream in terms of what we should be on the lookout for. And it's not just economic migrants coming from a contiguous country like Mexico or Central America. It's not just about the women and children that we saw in the summer of 2014 that were seeking asylum. The problem is not as simple as some people want to make it. But the fact that you have people representing 140 different countries entering between the legal ports of entry in the United States, will continue until it abates, will continue to be a national security challenge for this country. So very quickly on the capabilities, like I said, I'm not going to go through a laundry list of the stuff, the toys that we have to do the work. If you're interested, bring it up during the Q&A. The one thing that I wanted to really talk about was somewhat, I won't say it's revolutionary, but we had a challenge. When I came back to Washington, D.C. as the chief, and I was a chief for about 6 years. So the first couple of years when I was there, I would typically go up and do briefings in a situation room at the White House with the National Security Advisor. I'd be doing briefings with staffers both on the House and on the Senate side. I'd be doing congressional hearings. And one of the themes was, geez, Chief, you got to tell us how secure is the border? We had finite resources, even after we doubled the size of the organization, even after we built 700 miles of primary fence along the southern border, built some of those vehicle barriers. We still had a challenge because the area was very vast. But we also knew as operators there were sections along the border where people were not crossing for very good reason. One, the terrain wouldn't allow it. Have you ever been to Big Bend National Park? If you ever have an opportunity, it is the most gorgeous national park you will see. It is vast, and I can speak to it because I was with 5th Group Special Forces years ago on a mission, and I spent 30 days in that national park. During the day, I was sleeping in a hole. At night, we were going off from our mission support site and setting up in Big Bend looking for narcotics traffic. We saw 2 people in 30 days. We think it may have been the same person, but we couldn't confirm that on our after-action review. And it was a park ranger. And if you look at the terrain, tens of thousands of sheer cliffs into the United States. So again, if you're thinking of these organizations as a business and you want to make money, you're not going to set up shop in Boquillas and try to smuggle through Big Bend National Park. The challenge for us is even if that made sense, it was hard to convince people without evidence that we shouldn't build fence and put cameras there. So we had to figure out a way to do that. And so we came up with an initiative called Skyfall, mainly because I was a big, and still am a big James Bond fan. All right, there's no secret behind the operation name. That's the thing with the government. If you come up with an operation name, it's got to be really sexy, right? Because you got to convince people, you got to give them a little bit of initiative because you want people to support it. And if they support it and it gets a really neat name, then T-shirts get made and everybody wants to then support it even more. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not too much. And so what this initiative set out to do, within our force, we have 9 Predator Bs. You may hear them referred to as drones, right? So it's the same system that the Department of Defense has. And so what we set out to do is we wanted to prove, with evidence, that there were sections along the border where nothing was happening. Really try to prove the negative. How do we convince members of Congress and others that we believe that there's very low activity or no activity? And if we could, in effect, shrink that border, we may have an opportunity to solidify the forces that we have, increase their capability, and have a rational discussion about whether we should double or triple the size of the Border Patrol, which still goes on today. So what we did is we took one of the Predator Bs. We had from the agency a piece of equipment which was called synthetic aperture radar. Right, so just think of a radar, it pans back and forth, and so think of it almost like video, right? And so what we asked the field commanders to do is identify those sections along the border where you believe no activity or very low activity is occurring. And then go out there and take that video. Now these targets were maybe a mile wide, sometimes they may have been 20 miles wide, depending upon the terrain. We started first on the southern border. And so you can picture a Predator B would go up, we would launch and recover out of places like Fort Huachuca or Presidio, and it would go up, and the one thing about the Predator B is we would do what was, because it could stay up for like 18, 22 hours at a time. And so we would do what was called federated flights. So we would have a flight crew, these were pilot, co-pilot engineers set up in Fort Huachuca and the Intel base, and they would launch the Predator B, unmanned aerial system. Now, it's somewhat ironic, an unmanned system is very manpower intensive, right? So don't think it's just somehow there's nobody on the Predator. What's happened is a lot of people on the ground that are making it fly. At the end of their shift, they then just transfer the controls over to another ground control station that we have up in North Dakota. This is all run off of KU satellite band, so we're able to do that. So the Predator B goes up about 19,000 feet, right? You can't hear it, you can't see it. And it's doing other missions along the border for the Border Patrol. But somewhere along that sortie, it's going to image that picture, that 5 miles of border for that target. And it's going to do the same thing the next day. It's going to try to maintain the same airspeed, altitude, and angle, and it's going to image it. And now you have a before picture and an after picture. And that before and after radar signal and feed gets then fed into what we call as a processing, exploitation, and dissemination cell. It's a PET cell. It's then fed into a computer with very sophisticated algorithms to then identify anomalies. And so this is what it looks like. Again, I actually chose imagery where it actually shows something, right? Because it would be really boring if I explained, so look, there's like nothing across the border. Aren't you impressed? But what it does is it gives us the ability, and we have since 2013, we are now imaging over 800 miles along the southern border and over 1,000 miles on the northern border without having to put a Border Patrol agent, without having to put a camera system there. And by the way, only less than 1% of these images that I just explained is still being done with the Predator B. The vast majority is being done with what's called national technical means. So if you're interested in that, just Google search that. And you'll be able to figure out what that is. We do a lot of work with the Department of Defense, specifically with Northcom, who has as their primary mission Homeland Defense in Colorado Springs. If you're ever there, it's a great place to go visit. Right across from them is a component called Army Strategic Command. They have a lot of capabilities. So if you want to Google NRO and NGA, those are the folks that have been helping us really shrink this border down. You may hear the people talk about ISR. That's basically what ISR basically is. It's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And since we've done this initiative in March of 2013, we have maintained, which was kind of our goal, at or above 95% what we called confirmed non-illicit activity. In other words, we now have evidence, and going back to 2013, over hundreds of miles of border where incursions from Mexico into the United States are not occurring. And with that data, it gives us the ability to do a lot of stuff beyond just the regular analysis. It helps us frame when Congress comes up and knocks on the door again and says, hey, we want to double the size of the Border Patrol, what do you think? Probably not a good idea, right? Or, hey, we want to build 2,000 miles of wall. I don't know, you have to really take a look at what we're trying to protect against and what makes sense for the taxpayers. I'm going to leave this up as the last slide, just for a couple of minutes, talk about it. I'm going to transition the video, then I'm going to turn it over to you. So this was when we shifted our strategic thinking and changed the strategy in which we were doing border and national security in the agency. I asked a very sharp assistant chief on my staff. He's a graduate of the Army Roche College. He's currently working as a special advisor for Chairman Carter, the House Appropriations, for his second year. I asked Robert Schroeder, is his name, to write and basically tell this story. Help us get the message out about what we're doing and how we're changing it. So this trilogy is available online if you're interested. It talks a little bit more about these networks, about how we had to start thinking about border security in a little different way. Any questions on the slide decks before I transition? Oh man, just get the video up, would you? Got it. So what I will say, again, this was Yuma. The video's not really good. This was made a few years ago. We didn't have the budget as the FBI did, so this is kind of like a homegrown thing. So don't judge it because it's not as crisp and clear as some of the stuff that you may have done. But I think the content you may find interesting. And that, subject to your questions, concludes my prepared presentation. And I want to thank you again for allowing me to share my past 30 years as United States Border Patrol agent. Questions, comments, or concerns for the good of the group, speak now or forever hold your peace. Yes,
everyone. In your professional opinion, what is the biggest risk on our border? A lot of people seem to, like you said, immediately think of the border and think of immigration issues. But as far as you can tell, for terrorists or anything else?
Yeah. It has been, so the question is a great question, by the way. As a matter of fact, it was one that my staff and I would sit each operational cycle every year and say, hey, should we change what we would call our intelligence requirements? We would tell the intelligence community, these are the things that concern us, right? And the other way that question has been phrased over time is, hey, Chief, what keeps you up at night? Still, the greatest threat to this country in terms of national security is going to be terrorists or terrorist weapons entering this country to do harm to the citizens, pure and simple, right? So that doesn't mean that every day there's somebody that's trying to come across the border, with bandoliers and and a suicide vest, trying to come up into some metropolitan area. The problem is the border environment, because from a political standpoint and from a governmental standpoint, we have to understand, how do you secure the border? One of the challenges that I started in 2010 and trying to bring is, I bet right now, and I've done this in other groups, by the way, but I won't do it for the sake of time, is to ask everybody to write down on a 3x5 card what your definition of secure is. One thing people in Washington and perhaps in the country will discuss, and I don't think anybody here would say the opposite, that if I were to ask you, do you think we should have secure borders? I think everybody would say yes. That is a point of agreement that the vast majority of people say yes. Where the divergence happens is to what extent? How do you define that? What is the end state? And that was one of the challenges when we were working with members both on the House and on the Senate side. And it still is. The other thing is, what within U.S. Customs and Border Protection, what people don't know, every day, now I started off my day for the last 6 years, every day, getting an intelligence brief. Some of you may have heard about the PDB, it's the Presidential Daily Briefing. So in government, there is a concerted effort within the intelligence community to provide leaders of organizations within the government, both in the military and the law enforcement side, provide them with intelligence to answer those types of questions. And so we would have within the Border Patrol, within U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we wanted to know what potential terrorists were coming into this country. And every day when I would get a briefing along with the commissioner, my counterparts, in the intelligence community, we would look and people would be amazed at how many people every day are stopped from getting on a plane from Frankfurt into the United States, or from, you pick it, anywhere in Europe, anywhere from Northern Africa, that are not allowed to board a plane because we know, anybody hear of the watch list? Right, so the watch list, really the name of that is the TSDB. It's a terrorist screening database. And that contains people in the government can nominate, agencies can nominate people to be on that list. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody on that list is quote unquote a terrorist, right? They could be an operative, they could be a facilitator, a financier. There's a whole host of people that are on that list. What a lot of people don't know is the vast majority, over 90% of those people that are on that list are U.S. persons. So what does that mean? They're either U.S. citizens or lawfully admitted permanent residents. And based on the law, they are not what we would consider inexcludable. In other words, if they come into the United States, even though they're on the list, you can't deny them entry because they're U.S. persons. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody on that list is a terrorist. So the problem is a little bit more challenging in terms of, and nuance, as you look at how do you mitigate the risk of terrorists coming into this country. And I will tell you that the Department of Homeland Security has done tremendous things with advanced information. So it used to be that in a post 9/11 environment, the airlines were required at wheels up, right? As soon as a plane left, if that plane was coming to the United States, JFK, Houston, or flying over United States airspace, they had to provide to the United States government, to the Department of Homeland Security, to us in CBP, provide the manifest. And then what we would do is we would scrub all the systems that we had access to. U.S. Visit, which was a Department of Homeland Security. So we had biometric information of everybody, anybody that has come into the United States, legally or illegally. We would bounce it off of NCIC, the DOJ system. Did they have warrants? Were they ever arrested in the United States before? We would check off the Department of Defense ABA system, which was basically people that were being enrolled when the United States government went overseas in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, just to make sure that we were able to identify who these people were. Some of you may not remember in 2004, 2005 time period, every now and then the national news would talk about another plane that was diverted into Bangor, Maine, right? It was coming from Europe and it got diverted, and everybody was still trying to figure out if it was this another potential attack. Well, what would happen on those flights is when the airlines would send us the manifest, we would identify people on that plane that were potential individuals that we wanted to talk to. But we didn't know what the threat was, but we didn't want that threat coming into the final destination, which would have been like a JFK or Houston or an LAX. So what they would do is divert the plane to Bangor, Maine. Bangor, Maine just happens, anybody been to Bangor, Maine before? Great lobster, by the way. But it's one of the most far out northeast areas of the United States, and it's the first port of entry where international flights can be screened by us. And that's the reason why they were diverting those planes to figure out who those people were. So it is still going to be a threat, unfortunately, of the rest of your life. I don't think these organizations are just going to stop. They're always thinking, and they're still thinking about the airline threat. They're still thinking about ways to get into this country and to do harm to the citizens, to our economy, and that is the thing that still, keeps us focused on the mission. But thanks for the question. There's no better rewarding, again, my opinion, better rewarding career than getting up every day, kissing your loved one goodbye and going out and protecting this country. I mean, so if you're thinking about, well, is it a good career or not? As far as I'm concerned, there is. I'll leave you with one last thought too. Scorpionsecurity.net. You can go on that website, or you can get my direct contact information from Al. If any one of you have a follow-up question, it could be tomorrow, it could be next week, or 2 years from now, and you're thinking about a career, or hey, what about this agency? Please use me as a source, and I'd be more than happy to give you at least my insights. I won't tell you whether to put in for a position or not, but I will give you the benefit of my experience. And with that, thank you again for your attention.
Chief, I want to thank you for your service. Our country service, your agents do a great job, and a lot of people don't know exactly what you guys do, and you shared it with the class. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your service, and thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Let's give another
Thanks,
round of applause. Good job. Good job.